There always seemed to be one or more people within a tribe who had access to information and abilities that the others did not. They were able to see what was happening a couple of weeks from today and see what was happening right now, but maybe 1,000 miles away.
Dr. Dean Radin is a renowned scientist, author, and chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. He has dedicated his career to studying psychic phenomena and mind-matter interaction, and his research has been published in over 100 academic journals worldwide. In this conversation, we examine the scientific evidence for latent human abilities that could fundamentally transform our understanding of what it means to be a human.
The effects are real, and that in turn tells us there's something about today's model, our worldview, that is missing a significant chunk. And what's important about that chunk is a case can be made that most of the greatest advancements in science and technology comes from that realm.
Dean reveals how modern science is validating things previously considered impossible or magic.
Well, right now we're studying it as brain-to-brain correlations at a distance. The question there is, will the brains go into synchrony? Well, the answer is yes. It does go into synchrony. Using straightforward neuroscience techniques, we can see that the experience of telepathy happening in the brains.
This groundbreaking research may not only change science, but the society that we live in.
We're working towards what we fully expect someday will be part of mainstream science. Imagine that we got really, really good at developing methods for telepathy. Then that means that there's no secrets. It would require a major change to the structure of civilization itself.
Before we get into this conversation, I want to ask you to join this amazing community of consciousness explorers. This whole idea of pursuing expanded consciousness and the boundaries of human potential while living a modern life is relatively new, which is why we interview revered masters, teachers, experts, and practitioners to help you on your own journey. To stay up to date on the latest conversations, simply click subscribe below and you'll be notified each time a new episode comes out. I am so grateful for all of your support and comments. I love reading them. Now let's dive into this conversation. Hey, Dean, how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Wonderful. Well, I'm very excited to have this conversation. These emergent possibilities for humans and our reality and how it all works is something I'm endlessly fascinated in. And I think maybe where we could start the conversation is just giving the audience a little bit of background on the Noetic Sciences and its origin story.
Well, its origin is the beginning of human history. So I don't think we want to start there. But the idea is that, as we know from stories from anthropologists and what we know about shamanism, that there always seemed to be one or more people within a tribe who had access to information and abilities that the others did not. They were sometimes considered eccentric at best and crazy at worst, but the tribe knew that they actually had skills that were very important for their own survival because they were able to see what was happening a couple of weeks from today and see what was happening right now, but maybe 1,000 miles away. So that's what the shamans were all about. They were also healers. That eventually turned into many of the esoteric traditions in both the Eastern and Western philosophies, slightly different methods, but the origins were more or less the same. And the underlying philosophy of all of those was that consciousness was fundamental in some way, that ultimately all we actually can know comes through our conscious awareness. And in which case, everything that we know about the rest of the world, including all of our science and technology, are inferences based on our awareness, consciousness. And so the irony is that here we are thousands of years after the shamans, and science really still doesn't understand what consciousness is. Like, where does it come from? Is it really our sense of experience and personal awareness a result of activity, electrochemical activity happening in 3 pounds of neural tissue in your head? That is the prevailing idea because of philosophy of materialism, which is where we are today. I would say that the leading edge in many scientific disciplines today is that we got that wrong. That materialism is extremely successful as a method that accounts for many aspects of everyday awareness or everyday experience, but it doesn't explain the experience itself. And so you find thought leaders in the neurosciences and in physics and elsewhere saying, well, maybe we need to pay attention to the philosophy of science, because that's, after all, the assumptions on which we base everything that we think about. And that philosophy is materialism. Everything's made out of matter and energy, and that's the end of the story. From that perspective, it's very, very difficult to understand why we have any internal experiences at all. Right? We can, the easy way of describing the problem, called the hard problem, is that we can watch somebody eat a lemon, and we can trace from the outside everything all the way down almost to the atomic level about what happens when you bite into a lemon. All of the physiology, the chemistry, the electrochemistry, all of that, all the way down. But we can't tell from any of that, which is the scientific approach, well, what was it like to taste the lemon? That's not seen from the outside. You have to look at it from the inside. Well, what does that mean? That means from internal experience, which apparently is not really well accounted for, not accounted for at all by science today. So it just tells us that there's something important that's missing in our worldview. And the noetic sciences then are addressing the things that don't fit, more or less. It's the anomalies. It's mystical experience and psychic experience and spiritual experience. What are those things that are so important for people? And yet science is really struggling to try to understand what they are, and even to demonstrate that they actually do exist.
And when did this whole field that is beyond the scope of materialism become an area of interest and focus for you?
Well, the field, just broaden the question a little bit. The field was more or less defined by William James, the psychologist and philosopher, 150 years ago or so. For me, my interest in this as a discipline and as my career as a scientist was sparked probably when I was a preteen reading fairy tales. So, like in today's term, or 10 years ago, would have been reading Harry Potter or something like that. It sparks the imagination. And some kids are just naturally drawn to wondering about that a lot. And I think kids still today, this is why in movies and in fiction, children and then adults as well are just drawn to mythology, to fairy tales, and then to science fiction. It's a sense of wonder. What else are we capable of? So I never forgot that wonder. And so all through college and graduate school, and then even afterwards, I had learned through a friendly librarian that my interest in fairy tale and science fiction and mythology and science and mathematics, which I was drawn to all of those, was actually brought together in a discipline of parapsychology. So that was a section of the library I hadn't wandered into, but she brought me there and said, you might be interested in these books. And I was really fascinated, because now there was a connection between what science is really good at and these kinds of experiences. And I was able to see that you could connect the two and use the tools of science to begin to understand what are these experiences and how do we understand them.
And talk to me about what the process is like at the Institute of Noetic Sciences for studying these phenomena.
Well, everything ultimately starts with experience. Somebody has an experience, and we give them labels, like somebody has an experience of a mind-to-mind connection, and it doesn't look like it's in any of the usual or mundane explanations, like coincidence or something like that. So we get the label of telepathy, and of course, it's not us doing this. It's been around for 100 years. People have developed labels for these kinds of experiences. So we either have a competitive grant that we go for, where we get an idea, I'd like to study telepathy in this particular way. Like, for example, right now we're studying it as brain-to-brain correlations at a distance. In the neurosciences today, there's this notion of hyperscanning, which is kind of a social neuroscience, where if you take two people and you look at their brain activity and they're both looking at the same screen or playing the same game at the same time, you find that the brains go into synchrony. It's almost like they're two brains, but they're being synchronized by a common source. All that we're doing and has been done, about 24 experiments already published by colleagues and ourselves. We take the same idea as hyperscanning, except that we take one person over here and we isolate the other person. So they're no longer looking at the same game or same screen. One typically is isolated and just sitting there. And they're told, keep in mind your friend who's at a distance, and the friend is getting some kind of stimulus. The question there is, will the brains go into synchrony? Well, the answer is yes. It does go into synchrony. It's not anywhere near as strong as you see in hyperscanning, but you do see the correlations arise. And then this is a way of saying, well, using straightforward neuroscience techniques, we can see that that the experience of telepathy, which is not mind reading, it's more like the word itself meaning feeling at a distance. That's generally what it's more like. That we can see that happening in the brains. And then colleagues have done it with functional MRI, and they see where in the brain these connections are occurring. And so we're right now in the midst of recruiting people for a larger scale study doing this.
Sounds very interesting. I don't know if you've been following there's a new podcast out called the Telepathy Tapes that studies autistic children. It's incredibly fascinating. And so I'm really happy that you guys are putting some energy towards studying that phenomenon as well.
Yeah, I was interviewed for one of those episodes.
Nice, amazing. And so, and maybe you could just give a broad spectrum of like some of the other areas that you guys have studied at the Institute of Noetic Sciences beyond telepathy, just so people have an understanding of some of the scope of these anomalies.
Well, for years we did studies that are an analog of distant healing. So there's lots of people who practice various forms of so-called energy medicine, things like Reiki and Jo-Ray and therapeutic touch and all that sort of stuff. Most healers who do that kind of healing will admit after 3 beers and privately that their methods work at a distance just as well as they do close up. Now we're talking about some sort of physiological connection or mind-body connections from a distance. So we've did many studies like that where similar to brain-to-brain connections, you have a healer or somebody playing the role of a healer, and then you have isolated a person playing the role of a patient. You measure their physiology and you see what is the role of the healer or the sender's intentions and attentions on the body of the person who's isolated. So many hundreds of sessions of that kind of experiment, and those have been replicated by colleagues around the world as well. And it does show then that there's something happening. The body of one person will respond when the mind of the other person is focusing on them. So that's the jargon in the field is called DMILS, the DMILS, distant mental interactions with living systems. So that's an area of research we've done. We've also done quite a few studies on precognition, both conscious precognition, where you're like looking at a series of buttons on a screen and you press the one that you think will be selected by the computer later. So that's conscious response. But we've also done a bunch that we call presentiment, which is not pre-knowing, as in precognition, but pre-feeling. So the pre-feeling study wires somebody up to look at physiology. They look at a screen, they press a button, screen remains blank for 5 seconds, and then randomly an emotional or a calm picture is shown and is selected at random from a large pool of pictures. And then you see that for 3 seconds, it goes away, maybe for 30 seconds, and then you repeat. So you might do 30 or 40 of these short stimuli in a row. And the hypothesis is that unlike conscious precognition, in this case, it's as though you're your body can be used as a reflector of unconscious awareness. And so does your body respond before an emotional picture differently than before a calm picture? And the answer
Hmm.
is yes. There's 4 dozen experiments replicated around the world now that show, from a meta-analytic perspective, that there's very little doubt that this kind of phenomena is real. Everything I'm saying, by the way, always does come from somebody's experience. So the
Right.
experience of presentiment is an easy way of describing it is you're driving along the street and you're going to work and you do this 1,000 times, and at some point you get to an intersection with a light, traffic light. So you see a green light ahead of you, and normally you would speed up to get through the intersection, but today you feel there's just something wrong. It doesn't feel right somehow. You don't have any cognition about it, but it's just you have a green light and you're slowing down, and you continue to slow down all the way up to the light itself. The cars behind you are wondering what's going on, and so you actually get to the intersection, and by that time you're actually stopped, and you still have a green light, and then boom, through the intersection, a big truck blasts through because maybe their brakes failed or something like that. But the point is, if you had not slowed down, you'd been hit broadside and maybe killed, or at least a big accident. So what is that? I've heard this reported by lots of people in lots of different contexts. So we call it presentiment because you had a feeling as though your unconscious is always scanning for danger, typically. And it sometimes will bubble up into awareness, not of what the cognition was, but of the experience
Mm.
itself. So we have a way of then simulating that in the laboratory. That's this presentiment experiment. And in that experiment, we look at skin conductance and heart rate and pupil dilation and EEG, lots of different physiological measures. And basically all of them show that. They show it at different time scales because physiology is different for each one of these sensor systems. So that's one thing we've done. Another, you want me to keep going?
Maybe we do one more. And I think,
Okay.
where I was interested to understand is like, what have all of these experiments led you to believe about the nature of experience and reality?
Well, 2 things. First of all of these have something to do with consciousness, and not just conscious awareness, like everyday conscious awareness, but deeper levels of awareness that generally you would reach either through long-term meditation and sometimes through psychedelics. So there's everyday awareness is a very, very thin slice of what's going on out there. And so the moment you drop into sleep, you have a different kind of awareness, like lucid dreaming or just dreaming in general. And in meditative states, you have a different level of awareness and so on. So the everyday waking state is the worst possible state to be in to experience a psychic or a mystical experience. So that's one thing we learn. The other thing is that this sounds trivial, but we learn that those experiences of telepathy and clairvoyance and precognition and even psychokinetic effects, mind matter effects, they're quite real. There's a long list of things that look like that, coincidence and confabulation and fraud in some cases, a long list of things that are mundane, that are not psychic or mystical. But the phenomena themselves can be demonstrated in the laboratory at very high levels of confidence, mainly through meta-analysis, through lots of replications by ourselves and our colleagues. And that tells us that the effects are real. And that in turn tells us there's something about today's model, our worldview, that is missing a significant chunk. And what's important about that chunk is a case can be made that most of the greatest advancements in science and technology and religion and politics and you name it, whatever the discipline is, it comes from that realm. Some of it comes from our everyday analytical capabilities, but the inspirations, the insights, the things that actually become the next worldview, the things that shows our greatness as human beings, that comes from this other place. So you would think then it would behoove us all to better understand what is that space? How can we do that? How do we take these kinds of experiences that seem to transcend space and time and link it back into the rest of the scientific worldview? I think we can do that. That's kind of what we're working towards. But it does suggest, I think, pretty strongly that the worldview that we have today is simply a special case. Scientific worldview is a special case.
I hope you're enjoying this conversation so far. If you like what you hear, let me know by clicking like, subscribing to the channel, and responding with a comment around something that you found interesting in the conversation so far. In addition to these videos, I do a lot of writing on the exploration of consciousness and my own personal revelations in my newsletter called Consciousness: The Doorway to Human Evolution. To receive these updates and more, all you need to do is simply head to the link in the description below and you'll be added to the community of 20,000 plus consciousness explorers receiving weekly ideas and inspiration in their inbox. I look forward to hearing from you there. Now let's get back to the show. And you know, I'm with you, right? This notion of a much greater and more compelling, expansive human potential that we've read about, if anybody's, explored wisdom traditions, is incredibly exciting. Why is there so much resistance to opening to that and investigating it more broadly?
Well, one of the primary reasons is that we cannot yet plug what we know about science into these experiences. So think back 100 years ago, it was the data was pretty much the same as it is today. Their methods have changed over time and gotten better. But with classical physics, there was no way to be able to connect these kinds of experiences with what was understood about physics. And so a skeptic could say, and many did, that what you're describing is impossible. It violates the laws of physics. And we still hear that today by people who don't know what they're talking about because physics has changed. And so the notion that there are non-local connections that transcend space and time is now mainstream physics. We still don't know how to connect human experience to that physical world, this non-local connection world. But at some point through development of quantum biology, I think we'll probably get a lot closer to it. The other thing to keep in mind is that physics is not over, right? We keep learning new things, both from a classical physics perspective and quantum, and there'll be something beyond quantum as well. And the direction then the physics has been going is more and more compatible with the nature of these kinds of experiences. So this experience ultimately is that it's something about consciousness, thinking of it as a spectrum, conscious awareness and maybe super consciousness and subconscious with the whole thing, is not tightly locked into a local space-time. It seems to transcend space and time. And so at some point, we will look back on this and say, well, back then, meaning in the 21st century, at least the first couple of decades, they didn't know about fill in the blank, something quantum biological, whatever. Like the brain developed over hundreds of millions of years. It does operate in a quantum fashion, which is now kind of the leading edge of quantum biology. That being the case, it means that, yeah, a lot of our perception and cognition are driven by local senses, but it's also quantum. So it must have quantum senses, whatever that means. If that is the case, then we should be able to perceive throughout space and time. So there we have clairvoyance and precognition. But we also have agency. Consciousness is both a matter of perception and agency. We can do things with our consciousness, in which case, maybe through the quantum observer effect cast into humans, we could also influence the world at large. In which case, now we've covered the whole psychokinetic side of these experiences. So we and our colleagues around the world, about 40 of us perhaps, that are actively working in this area, and then hundreds more who are deeply interested and know about what we're doing, but they may not be active in the laboratory. We're working towards what we fully expect someday will be part of mainstream science. there's a lot of pressure then against why we shouldn't do that. So this goes back to your original question. If these things are demonstrable in the laboratory, why is there so much resistance? So part of it is because it has been thought for a long time by people who don't know what they're talking about that it's impossible. Well, that's just simply a matter of education. You say, no, it actually is possible now. The second thing is that these kinds of phenomena from an orthodox religious perspective have been pushed aside and are called demonic by most religions, unless the phenomena are performed within the auspices of the church. So the easy way to look at that is through the Catholic Catechism, where psychic phenomena, all of these kinds of phenomena and magical phenomena, which are very closely related, are considered demonic unless they're performed by a priest who is anointed in the right way and is performed in the right context. That still has a very strong push from some people who don't want this to be studied. They don't want the topic to be studied because they consider it to be demonic. It's like you're not doing it within the church, so don't do it. And there's pressure there. The other side of it is, from the scientific perspective, going all the way back to Galileo and his contemporaries, plus or minus 100 years, they knew back then that if they countered the church's interest, they would be killed, and some were killed. So there was a very strong pressure within science to only look at the objective physical world. And there was a kind of a uneasy alliance that was made with the church at the time, where the church said, we have everything to do with spirit. Don't touch it. Don't even research it. By spirit, they meant, among other things, consciousness and spirituality, all of that, anything having to do with the internal world. So science developed right from the very beginning with a sense that we can study this, but we shall not study that. That includes psychic phenomena. So we have pressure both from science and from religion saying, don't do that. And you see it reflected, among other things, by saying how much federal dollars are spent studying these things. Zero. All of our money comes from a few foundations in the world, one in particular in Portugal, and individual donors who are interested in what we do. That's how we do this. And you see even echoed in the academic world, there's very, very strong pressure to say we either will completely ignore this domain, even though privately most academics, like most lay people, have had these experiences and are vitally interested in them. Or we will say we can study beliefs about these experiences, but the reason why people believe in things like telepathy and clairvoyance is because they have some sort of cognitive deficit. You see this again and again, and mainly in psychological papers. So there's pressure from both sides. And then there's a third level, which is fear.
Right.
And the fear is an interesting one, because imagine that we got really, really good at developing methods for telepathy. Take an average person and we can turn them into what amounts to a telepath. Then that means that there's no secrets. If you have that on a large scale, everything having to do with politics and government and business and law and everything else we can think of that doesn't have secrets, that is not the world that we live in. It would require a major change to the structure of civilization itself. So you can imagine the amount of pressure coming from government, from business, and from other areas where secrets are necessary, or at least thought to be necessary. And so they don't want that to be studied either, except maybe under highly classified conditions, because then it could be useful because you can figure out what your adversaries are up to. And that has been the case. There are classified programs that went on for a very long time.
Yeah, the things like the Gateway Papers come up for me as, just examples of like things you see from our government, and like, you guys knew this stuff and were studying it, and that was going on. You didn't tell us. And it's, what strikes me is that, there's this underlying, like, I've had a lot of scientists on the show who have been studying this stuff. And there seems to be just this like kind of underlying egocentric paradigm that we've been in, that people are afraid that they're wrong, that everything they've done is wrong. People are afraid of what this could lead to. People are afraid that this could destroy businesses if this is and profits and all of these things. And all of these people studying these amazing things are struggling to get funding. And it's
Yep.
just the wildest thing to me. And I'm wondering, like, what is what change needs to happen, do you think, for real resources to start to flood into the type of work that you're doing and just the whole noetic science and studies of all of these things? Because it seems like that's kind of a critical blocker right now.
Yeah, it's certainly one of the blocks is funding. But that, I mean, that every scientist in every discipline will say the same thing. We always need more funding. We're in a special case because we don't get federal funding, and because of pressure on other large foundations that could provide funding that don't, because they're worried about their image, so they don't do it.
Interesting.
So the other thing, I think the model that I like to keep in mind is the University of Edinburgh. So the University of Edinburgh in Scotland in 1985 got a bequest from from Arthur Kessler's estate, the author, for £500,000 to establish a endowed chair for parapsychology within the psychology department. And so that program is still going. That was 1985, and now there are over 100 PhDs that have come through that program that have been trained in the methods, the history, the literature of parapsychology. And it has made the UK the world center for interest. And more importantly, it has also significantly reduced the taboo. So in the UK, it's also that the UK responds to people who are considered eccentric in a slightly different way than they would in the US, for example. If you're eccentric as an academic in the US, you better have tenure, because otherwise you won't remain in the academic system very long. In the UK, it's a little different. Somebody who's almost expected to be eccentric as an academic. It's like, it's okay. That's what they do. They're pushing the envelope. But every culture, every country has slightly different reactions to it. In some countries, like the US, if you deviate from the norm, you don't stay in academia for very long. Even when you get tenure, there's pressure to not deviate from the norm, which, when you think about it, is completely insane, because that's exactly, especially when you get tenure, you want people to push the envelope all the time. That means you're going to be studying anomalies. You're going to be studying things that people may find uncomfortable. You're going to be challenging ideas. That's where innovation comes from. What we see happening then, to a large extent, is that happens through business in the United States. Like, our entrepreneurs are the ones who are pushing it, which is fine. I mean, it works. That's where innovation comes from. But it also is constraining, because it means that much of that push, the entrepreneurial push, is towards products. Like, how do we make money out of this thing that we came up with? Whereas if you look at, say, you have a business and they have a big section within that business of pushing to figure out how can we eventually use psychic phenomena? How can we create something by which we can make money from people who become really, really good at telepathy, or really good at precognition, or really good at fill in the blank? Well, it may take 20 years to get there. So maybe you need a giant company like Google to have a whole division focusing on this. A small company would find it difficult, mainly because, again, of how do you support people for 20 years to figure out something which at this point is a promise rather than something which is certain. So go back to Edinburgh. So the way I think you want to change this is multiple directions. One is you need many, many more people who know about the literature, so that you don't keep reinventing the wheel. A lot has been learned about methods, about what we think works and doesn't work, and so on. But you need training for people. They need to go through some kind of a system. Well, that's what the academic system is good for. You create 10 endowed chairs in universities around the US, and within a couple of generations, you'll have thousands of people who are now applying their interest to these areas. that's when you begin to see, I mean, like we're at the beginning of an exponential curve, but that will bring it up to the knee. And then, then we learn quickly. So that's part of it, is the educational part. The other part is that there are lots and lots of areas that could be looked at, but you need money to do so. So I'll give one example. So one of my interests is applying the quantum observer effect as a kind of a quantum level mind-matter interaction. And this is one of the viable interpretations of quantum mechanics, that something about consciousness collapses the wave function, so-called. And I've done many experiments in this domain using things like double-slit optical systems. And we've used the money that we have to build the best equipment that we were able to put together. And we find interesting effects. And we've now inspired several other laboratories to do similar work, and they see similar effects. That's a major game changer. If we can show that one of the 13 or 14 interpretations of quantum mechanics, roughly 6 of them have something to do with observation being important, and 2 of these interpretations say that consciousness is involved in the physical world directly, that's important to know. So what I would rather do, having worked in academic optical systems before, is to have, rather than $10,000 or $30,000 to build an optical system for this kind of experiment, a couple of $100,000s to get a proper optical bench and all of the equipment, and to do things at the level that you find in mainstream science today, like top tier level science, because you can just do a lot more than you can if you're building by hand, which I have done, small optical systems that you still get effects with, but it would be so much more efficient to have the ones that just cost a lot of money. So that would be a major advancement too, that simply have more money to build better equipment, and to find people who are exceptionally good at these various tasks. So we generally will choose meditators, because meditators can pay attention, which is what most of these tasks require. But just recently I finished a study which was again looking at the quantum observer effect. But
can you define that just really quickly, just so people that may be less familiar with it can understand what you're referencing?
The quantum observer effect?
Correct.
Yeah. So one of the many strange things about quantum mechanics is that in the quantum world, before you observe a quanta, a particle like an electron or photon or whatever, before you observe it, it doesn't have properties in the way that we understand properties of everyday objects. Right? We look at an object and we say, well, it's this weight and it's this color and it has properties. That's what defines the object. In the quantum world, it appears that quanta do not have properties in that way until it is observed or measured. The moment you measure something, it gains the property, which means the interpretation of it is that a quanta, an electron, say, which may have spin, it may have charge, it may have a certain amount of mass, it has all possible properties, all at the same time, and then it is measured or observed, and then suddenly it gains that property. Well, so this is like a collapse. There's something about the knowing that collapses the system from a superposition of all possible states into one state. And so the way that this is demonstrated in Physics 101 is you have an optical system where you send a photon through 2 little slits. So the photon will either go through the left or through the right. You measure the interference pattern that you get when the photons go through the 2 slits, and you end up with this band of bright and dark bands. It's from interference of the photon. Well, you get that band because of the wave-like nature of light. And this is why light is wave-like and particle-like at the same time. It's wave-like until you know which of the 2 slits the photon goes through, and there's lots of ways of measuring when that happens. The moment that you know, it no longer behaves like a wave, it behaves like a particle. So this is this wave-particle duality of light. It's not that it is a particle or that it is a wave, but it can act in that way because we don't really know what a photon is, the packet of energy that is strange. So the point of this is there's something about measurement which implies observation, and that's where the real question begins. What does it mean to observe something? Do you need to consciously observe it? Can a machine observe it? Does it require consciousness? All of those kinds of things. So our experiment is looking specifically at whether consciousness is necessary, or is consciousness is a factor in the collapse of the wave function. That's what these optical experiments are all about. So that's what I mean by the quantum observer effect. It's one of the many outstanding puzzles that suggest that there's a role for consciousness in the behavior of the physical world.
One of the things I was interested to zoom into is that you mentioned you had started a business that was about enhancing or modifying human consciousness. And I was definitely curious to learn more about that.
So one of the many projects that we've been interested in is we call psi-genes. And this comes about from folklore that you find in every culture, that there's some families that seem to be naturally talented in this domain. So I was at the University of Edinburgh some time ago, and there was a graduate student at the time who was studying Scottish second sight, which is the idea, it's basically precognition or clairvoyance in some families in northern Scotland. Well, you find similar ideas everywhere, but it's called something else, but it usually has to do with my grandmother knew when somebody at a distance had died, that sort of thing. And then it seems to go through generations, typically on the female side, but not always. Sometimes it'll jump generations, it'll jump genders, but it's in the family. Of course, this immediately raises the nature versus nurture idea, that some families may simply be open to it and allow the ability to be seen. Or maybe there is a genetic component, because after all, there's a genetic component for sports ability, for musical ability, for intelligence, for all kinds of things. So maybe there's some kind of genetic basis for psychic ability as well. In fact, most of the naturally talented psychic people I know will say someone else in the family has that too, has the ability. So we did a small-scale experiment where we got the DNA from people who said that they were psychic and came from psychic families, and did some online tests to vet that they actually had some ability. And then we got DNA from controls who were matched by age and gender, who never reported anything psychic, and nor did anybody in their family. And so this is called the case control study, and it's done with tens of thousands of cases and controls for studying things like schizophrenia. Like, what's the genetic basis of that particular disease, which is also a genetic thing. But we didn't have that kind of money, so we did a small-scale study, and we found a difference. Well, we've also recently done additional studies using data from 23andMe, where we got the data, we asked people a bunch of questions, and we find that there's certain kinds of psychic abilities that seem to show up in their genome. So that study we did maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And at the time I was thinking that, well, this is interesting, because it was around that time that CRISPR, the DNA editing method, was becoming popular. And we thought, well, maybe we could do a genetic edit to enhance somebody's natural abilities through a genetic means by manipulating receptors in the brain, so that they would become momentarily or even permanently more psychic, because now we're able to basically give somebody a talent that they didn't have before. Around the same time, I was contacted by a person I didn't know, but now is my co-founder in the company, who said many, many years ago, 50 years ago, when he said this, during an LSD experience, that he got a download. And it was about how would you begin to manipulate some aspects of the way that the brain works in order to essentially open one's consciousness. That's what he got. And he was telling me this story, and I was thinking, oh, we almost have a technology that can do that now. at the time was CRISPR, we pretty quickly moved over into RNA. So it would be a temporary fix because we don't know enough about, we don't want to permanently change somebody's brain at this point until we're really sure what we're doing. So an RNA would be a temporary thing. So we're using RNA interference as a way of downregulating certain receptors in the brain. And rather jumping directly into something like cognitive enhancement, which would include psychic enhancement, we decided that for pragmatic purposes, that we first need to focus on psychiatric indications, mental health indications. Our first indication was, can we manipulate certain receptors in the brain to essentially cure, or at least a long-term treatment for chronic anxiety? The answer is yes. It's 5-HT2A, that receptor, same receptor that psychedelics work on. So we have a way of doing to the receptors directly, only those receptors in the brain, through an intranasal delivery of RNA interference. It's actually it's short hairpin RNA, shRNA. So we know where it goes. We know in our animal models that it works really, really well, significantly well, for reducing anxiety and increasing memory. So it's the second part, which was a guess on our part. It turns out that it's even stronger than an anti-anxiety effect because it goes into the hippocampus and reduces hyperactivity. So we are now gearing up to do clinical trials. We're pretty sure that this is going to work in humans, and it would provide an entirely new class of treatments for mild cognitive impairment and for dementia, and maybe for early onset Alzheimer's. But this is like product number one of a long, long list. We have like 50 different things that we can think that would work. It would work potentially for OCD, for PTSD, for schizophrenia, for psychosis, for the whole range of psychiatric disorders that have a known neurological basis. So intranasal delivery is very easy. We know where it goes in the brain. We know how to only make it work on certain receptors. So we publish a bunch of papers on this now. And I think what's interesting about this, besides the fact that we were working on a new kind of treatment, is that the reason why it comes about, which is more often true than not, is the combination of an LSD download
Right.
that was told to somebody who was able to decipher it, because these downloads typically are not highly technical. It's like a concept. It's like a concept of a plan. Well, here's a download I was thinking of. Oh, we actually can do this now, because I've heard lots and lots of downloads from people in meditative states, in mystical states, and so on, most of which we don't know what they're doing. We don't even understand it at all. It's like too far advanced. Well, this was a download from 50 years ago. It took 50 years to get to the point where we actually have the technology now that we could do it. So if somebody gives me a download on how to do anti-gravity machine, maybe they're 500 years ahead. You know, it involves crystals and things and light, and okay, but we don't know. I don't even know how to interpret that. Whereas in this case, I did, and it looks like it's leading to a new class of treatments for psychiatric problems that in some cases are completely intractable, and in other cases require drugs like SSRI drugs that have all kinds of horrible side effects, whereas our approach wouldn't have any side effects because it is precise medicine.
Wow, what an amazing story, and I'm excited to learn and watch more as you guys progress with that. And it also speaks to the notion of, yeah, there's information beyond space and time that's available, and there's different ways that people can tap into it and then apply it. And that's exactly what's happening with this business, which is so cool. One of the things that also came up for me as you were talking about this is, I've heard a lot of people talk about how humans have, DNA that isn't turned on. It's like junk DNA, and it's like the evolution of our consciousness leads to certain DNAs becoming activated. Have you explored that at all? Is there a potentiality there?
Well, you're talking about epigenetics, right? So we all come into this world with a certain group of genes the genes are not all turned on at the same time. So some are never turned on. But through epigenetic methods, it used to be called junk DNA, but it's now not. There's the portion of the DNA that it does not code for protein, called the intron sequence. So the sequence of DNA is billions of nucleotide pairs. Only a small percentage of that actually codes for protein. So our body is made up of proteins. Well, what's happening with all the rest of it? The rest of it essentially is kind of a software switch. So if you meditate a lot, you're going to start turning on genes that otherwise may not be turned on. You find that your physical and mental existence begin to change as a result of all of these genes that are being stimulated to turn on that otherwise may not have. It goes in the other direction too, that you can find that if you're under an enormous amount of stress, that genes will get twiddled in a way that is generally not good for you. And that's an epigenetic effect as well. So, yeah, so we have a given set of building blocks to work with, but we also have this huge, somewhat metaphorically, software that can begin to modulate the hard-coded portions of it. So, well, what do we know about that in terms of psychic phenomena? We know that meditation, if somebody begins to meditate, the very first thing that they start to notice is increase in synchronicities. So it might be simply paying attention to things that they hadn't paid attention to, but at very long-term meditation, or people who have talent for meditation, because you can have a talent, they will discover pretty quickly what the yogis have known thousands of years ago, which is that the yogis would call these kinds of abilities siddhis. So the SIDDHI. So a siddhi from the yogic tradition is what we today would call psychic phenomena. There were roughly 25 siddhis that were defined by Patanjali, who wrote the Yoga Sutras.
The Sutras, yep.
Yeah. So when you look through those 25 siddhis, they include things like invisibility and levitation and so on, which we don't see today. But the first couple of siddhis we do see. The very first siddhi that Patanjali mentions is the ability to see past, present, and future all at the same time. Well, we call it clairvoyance or precognition. So that is the very first siddhi that is considered very elementary from a yogic perspective. And in fact, when we've surveyed beginning meditators, they start talking about, oh, yeah, I'm getting these synchronicities where I'm like, I know what's about to happen, or I can somehow feel what's happening at a distance. Well, that's siddhi number one. And then it goes on, becomes more complex after that. That strongly suggests that because meditation is an epigenetic switch in many ways, that yeah, if we learn the right kinds of switches to throw, most of us will not only find that we can have some of these abilities, but some people who are probably talented and may not know it yet would find that they're actually very talented in one or more of these domains. Because like any other kind of talent, you may be really good at these two things, but you can't do that at all. Well, you may never know about any of it until you start trying to do some kind of exercises that will bring your awareness to what you're actually capable of.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I also observe a lot of unconscious competence with these things where, like, I hear very famous entrepreneurs talking about following their intuition, for example. And I mean, they're some of the most successful people in the world, but at the same time, I'll hear them talk about how they are not spiritual. And so they're like tapping into this source of information that to me appears to be a psychic ability, but they would never, ever, ever admit to that or know that or seek that out or learn to do more of it. And it's pretty amazing to see.
Yeah. So there's a big cultural taboo that prevents people from being open about these kinds of topics. It's not clear to me. I mean, we don't really know what spiritual means. If you ask 1,000 people, you get 1,000 different responses. And as a general, maybe an overarching way of thinking about it, it's a sense that there's something more, something bigger, something more larger capacity, something like that. Occasionally, you'll have people who say, well, it's going into the divine. Well, now we're talking about the supernatural. Well, we're pretty comfortable with the natural. Science certainly doesn't know how to go into the supernatural other than things like super abilities. But supernatural is suggesting above the natural world, beyond the natural world. We don't even know exactly what that means, because if you look at the history of science, it has always started with here's the natural world. Oh, now we understand this, and now we understand this, and now quantum mechanics and relativity. Our natural world is probably already out into aspects of what used to be called the supernatural. It's just
Mm.
simply an expansion of what we understand. So whether the supernatural and what we think of, what we call the divine, we don't know what that means. And so one of the reasons I think that some are not comfortable talking about spirituality is because they know they're going to start intruding on people's religious beliefs. And so it simply becomes a pragmatic way of avoiding a topic because you never know who you're going to piss off, or some people you might attract as a result. But I can see them from a very pragmatic business perspective. You want to keep it sort of straight and narrow and be careful uh, about disrupting people's sensibilities. And so
Mm.
you may want to avoid certain words. And that goes on all the time in the academic world as well. You don't talk about this stuff in public. It is very much like Fight Club. You don't talk about Fight Club. You don't talk about psychic ability. You avoid talking about spirituality except in certain contexts.
And that's a self-preservation thing, you think?
It's a social construct, right? What people tell you in private after 3 or 4 beers is very, very different than what they're willing to go on a stage and talk about.
Do you have a hypothesis? And I know in your book, Real Magic, you talk about kind of 3 examples of Merlin type abilities that have been documented throughout history. And then we have things like the Yoga Sutras that, I mean, I presume those don't just come out of nowhere. Why historically there have been a greater capacity to witness these things or documentation of these things than we currently are experiencing in our present day?
Because of this thing. That's why. So take this as an analogy for the
And
ways that we are.
everyone, just really quick, that was a phone that
Oh
for
yeah,
people listening that Dean just put up on the screen.
yeah. I showed an iPhone, and so it's an analogy for the ways that we are distracted. So we have so many distractions. For a person living in a developed world, doing normal kinds of jobs and so on, we're constantly distracted. And so when you look at historically somebody like St. Joseph of Cupertino, who was seen to have levitated many, many times by thousands of people and became a saint as a result. It turns out, though, that there's something like 24 of the saints were people who became saints as a result of hundreds or thousands of people who saw them levitate or bilocate or both. So these are considered miracles today. We don't see anybody who can do that today. Well, why not? Because they're all on their cell phones all the time and
Mm.
they're looking at TikTok or something. So those people, the people in our historical past who were able to do this, and by the way, there's still people today who are claimed to be able to do bilocation, generally in religious context,
Mm.
but they're not saturated with these distractions. They're in contemplative environments like ashrams or monasteries. Their job essentially is to meditate or to pray. And so some people today have that job, but not too many.
Right.
And it's also, more importantly, it's not valued in the way that it would have been back then. So it's a combination also of people today who do have those talents, but know very well that they should not become public with them. Because if they did go public, their lives would be in danger. There would be a lot of people who want to get rid of them real quick.
Right.
And so they have to be very, very careful about not revealing that they have those abilities. So my guess is probably about 1 in 10,000 people are talented, and maybe 1 in a million is extremely talented, like in the stories of Merlin. But It still means there's 8,000 people in the world who have these super abilities, but they know very well not to. They know, among other things, that I would love to study that kind of person in the laboratory, but they would see me coming 1,000 miles away and 1,000 days in advance and know where to be so that I would never find them.
Right. And this is not, I mean, I don't blame them, right? We have a storied history of persecuting these people in Europe and the United States, and people that seem to have access to something that people in power didn't like that they had access to that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's nuts. It's the modern Inquisition. In this case, you can think of it with a slight put on your paranoia hat that the government, all governments, would not like the idea that somebody has the capacity to learn all of their secrets. It's just,
Well,
right? It's too dangerous.
we already have gotten a preview of that with John McAfee, the person that invented the McAfee software, who gave the laptops to the government to use and then knew what was happening, and he mysteriously disappeared.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we have that evidence. Well, Dean, this has been a tremendous conversation. Thank you for explaining kind of just the state of things in the scientific world of studying these phenomena and how that might shift. I think we're just at an incredible inflection point in history. And I want to give you an opportunity to talk about where people could learn more. The work that you're doing, the books you've published, some of the things that you're putting out there, if they want to just continue to follow along, and also if they want to support you.
Well, I'm at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, so you probably will already have noetic.org as a link somewhere. My personal website is deanradin.com. And there I posted my books. I have a fifth book coming out. The title is Enchantment, which will come out in 2025 in the summer, something like that. And it's a follow-up of my previous book, Real Magic. And these two books are showing how psychic ability and magical ability are exactly the same thing, seen from different cultural perspectives. And so the value of this is that psychic ability, as studied by science, has verified that some of the ideas about magic, which I put in the categories of enchantment, which is mind-matter interaction, divination, which is perceiving through space and time, and theurgy, which involves things like mediumship or interacting with spirits or non-human intelligence in some way. All of those have been studied by science. Most of it has been verified as something that is real. That is what we traditionally think of as magic. And so part of the story then behind this is that science is slowly gaining the competence of being able to look at ideas about magic and finding out what works, what doesn't work, and more importantly, why it works, which for thousands of years was considered part of esoteric knowledge. But now we're beginning to plug in some aspects of science to understand why were these magical ideas so prevalent for so long, and some of them actually do work. And are they going to be seen as threats by someone somewhere? Well, as I already mentioned before, that one of the pressures to not do this kind of research is the fear that people will become too powerful. And governments generally don't like people to be all that powerful. So there's ethical considerations and sociological considerations, lots of interesting side topics besides just the raw, the basic science itself. This, by the way, is true for any advancement in science. There's always going to be ethical and sociological issues that come about, like the development of CRISPR, right? Do we want designer babies or not? Well, it's going to happen independent of any kind of regulations that are put on that technology. I believe the same will happen for what we currently call psychic methods, but someday we're going to have other names for it, and magical methods as well.
Well, an exciting time to be alive, and I look forward to reading Enchantment when it comes out.
Great.
And I just want to say thank you, everybody, for listening as well. It's been a real pleasure, Dean. And yeah, just continue doing what you're doing, man. It's really needed and awesome stuff.
Thank you.